Have you ever wondered if an ordinary person could achieve the impossible? What if there was someone whose actions defied all human limits, whose very presence sent kingdoms into awe and fear? This is the story of Elisha, a chosen prophet, a man whose power seemed beyond explanation. His miracles weren't just wonders, they were divine signs that raise profound questions about the forces at work behind what we perceive as reality. What seems like the stuff of legend, Elisha made real. His actions weren't just about power, they were revelations, challenging the very fabric of the world. Each miracle he performed made the impossible seem possible, leaving the world to wonder what lies behind this man. And what does his faith truly reveal about the power of the divine? As we unravel his story, the mysteries deepen, showing that his journey was not just about miracles, it was about something far greater. Now, I want to ask you, are you ready to explore a realm where the impossible becomes possible? If Elisha's journey speaks to you, type 777 inches, the comments below, as a sign of your faith and readiness to embrace the divine power that surrounds us all. And to everyone who has supported us through Super Thanks, thank you. Your generosity helps us bring these incredible stories to life. Let's dive deeper into the extraordinary life of Elisha, a journey that challenges everything we thought we knew about miracles, faith, and the unseen forces at play. The adventure begins now. The hidden truth about Elisha, the prophet who shocked the world with his miracles. Elisha's journey began in the quiet, humble town of Abel Mahola, where he was born into a family that lived off the land, tilling the soil and living a simple, hard-working life. His name, God is Salvation, held an air of divine purpose, though no one could have predicted how his life would unfold. As a young man, he worked alongside his father in the fields, never seeking attention, never imagining that his days of quiet labor would soon be replaced by an extraordinary destiny. One day, the very soil he worked on became the stage for a divine calling that would shake the nation. It was here that Elisha encountered Elijah, the great prophet of Israel. The world already trembled under the power of Elijah's word. Kings feared him, and the people respected him as the fierce voice of God. But it was not until the moment Elijah approached Elisha, casting his mantle over him, that the young man's fate was sealed. This simple act, a symbol of divine appointment, marked the beginning of a journey that would change the course of Israel's history. Elisha did not hesitate. His life as he knew it, his family, his livelihood, his peaceful existence vanished in an instant. He followed Elijah without a backward glance, stepping into a world filled with wonders, dangers, and revelations. The teachings of Elijah were not easy to absorb, but Elisha's devotion was unshakable. Even when Elijah tried to send him away, Elisha knew something that no one else seemed to understand. Elijah's time was drawing to a close. Despite every attempt to make him leave, Elisha remained unwavering, resolute. This was his calling, and he would not abandon it. The day came when Elijah and Elisha stood at the banks of the Jordan River, one of the most significant moments in their shared journey. With a single strike of his mantle upon the water, Elijah parted the river before them, allowing them to walk through on dry ground. Elisha, witnessing this miracle, knew that this was his moment to make a request that would define his future. "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit," he asked. knowing that this was not just a request for power, but a plea for the strength to continue the prophetic work that had shaped his life. Elijah promised him that if he witnessed his ascension, his request would be granted. Just as the words left Elijah's mouth, the air began to shift. A whirlwind appeared in the sky, and a chariot of fire descended, pulling Elijah away, up into the heavens, in a spectacle so dramatic it could only be described as divine. Elisha, standing on the earth, was left alone with a mantle of his own, a mantle that symbolized not only Elijah's power, but the immense responsibility that now rested on his shoulders. Clad in the same mantle that had once belonged to the great prophet, Elisha now stood, clothed not just in a piece of cloth, but in divine authority. The call that had once been Elijah's was now his own, and with it, the responsibility to fulfill God's will upon the earth. The Jordan River lay before him, still and unyielding. Without a moment's doubt, Elisha approached the waters and, with a single strike of the mantle, mimicked the very act of his predecessor. The waters parted just as they had before, and Elisha crossed through, stepping boldly into the role he was now to play. As he crossed, the watching prophets, who had witnessed this incredible moment from afar, saw the unmistakable sign. They recognized that the spirit of Elijah, the very power of God, had now transferred to Elisha. The man who had once tilled the land as a farmer was now the chosen prophet of Israel, and the miracles had only just begun. Elisha's first public act of divine power came soon after, in the city of Jericho. The people, burdened with despair, spoke of their troubles, how the waters of their city were foul, and their land barren. The very life-giving water they depended on was polluted, rendering the land unproductive. It was in this moment of need that Elisha made his entrance. Without hesitation, he asked for a bowl of salt, and with divine authority, he cast it into the spring of water. He spoke, declaring that God had healed the waters, that the land would no longer suffer, and that the curse would be lifted. In an instant, the transformation was visible. The water, once bitter and poisonous, became pure, and the land, once barren, began to flourish again. The very soil that had resisted life now yielded its fruits. Elisha's act was not just a miracle, it was a powerful declaration that God's hand was upon him, that his words carried the weight of divine authority, and that through him, God was bringing healing and restoration to the land. Isn't it remarkable how a simple act of faith and obedience can transform a situation from despair to hope, from barrenness to abundance? Elisha's first miracle was not only a demonstration of God's power through him, but also a symbol of the restoration God desires to bring into the lives of his people. Elisha, the farmer turned prophet, became a conduit of God's miraculous power. And in this moment, the question must be asked, what if we, too, allowed God to use us as instruments of restoration in our own lives and the lives of others? As Elisha journeyed away from the city of Jericho, the weight of his divine calling pressed upon him. Little did he know, as he walked with God's mantle still heavy upon his shoulders, that a challenge would soon arise from an unexpected source. A group of boys, likely emboldened by their ignorance and youthful arrogance, came out from the city gates. They saw Elisha, the prophet of God, walking by, and in a fit of mockery, they jeered at him, calling him bald head. With their words, they not only insulted Elisha, but they also mocked the very presence of God that rested upon him. To them, it was just a joke, a passing moment of ridicule, but they did not realize the gravity of their actions. In their foolishness, they had dishonored God's chosen vessel, and in doing so, they unknowingly provoked the wrath of heaven. For Elisha, this moment was not one of petty anger, but a solemn moment of divine judgment. His response was swift and filled with divine authority. Without hesitation, he turned to face the boys and, invoking the name of the Lord, he pronounced a curse upon them. In that instant, the ground seemed to tremble with the power of Elisha's words. From the surrounding forest, 2 bears emerged, fierce and wild, as if summoned by the very heavens themselves. In a terrifying display of divine justice, the bears charged at the boys, mauling 42 of them. The once playful mockery turned into a horrifying reality. The scene was a sobering reminder to all who witnessed it. There are consequences for mocking the servants of God and for dishonoring his authority. What many may have seen as an act of cruelty was, in fact, a demonstration of God's holy righteousness. Elisha, though a prophet of mercy and grace, also carried the weight of God's judgment. His authority was not to be taken lightly. Through this terrifying event, the people of Israel were reminded of the sacredness of God's call and the respect due to those he chooses to speak his word. One day, a widow approached Elisha, her face etched with worry and desperation. She was burdened by a heavy, inescapable reality. Her husband, the man who had once cared for her and their 2 sons, was gone, leaving behind a mountain of debt. The creditors, relentless and unforgiving, were coming to take her sons as slaves to settle the debt that hung over her like a dark cloud. Her heart was shattered with grief, knowing that her beloved children, the only family she had left, were about to be torn from her. In her time of despair, she turned to Elisha, hoping that the prophet might have the answer. She poured out her plight before him, her voice trembling as she spoke of the hopelessness she felt. Elisha, sensing both the gravity of her situation and the compassion of her heart, asked a simple yet profound question. "What do you have in your house?" Her response was quiet, almost resigned. Nothing, except a jar of oil. A single jar of oil, seemingly insignificant, a mere remnant of what had once been. But to Elisha, this small offering was enough. He saw the potential in her meager possession, the seed of hope that God could multiply. Elisha, under divine inspiration, gave her instructions that seemed, at first, to be as unlikely as they were simple. Go and borrow empty vessels from all your neighbors. Gather as many as you can. Then, take the jar of oil you have and begin pouring it into each one. The widow, filled with both faith and doubt, did as Elisha instructed. She went from house to house, gathering every vessel she could find, unsure of how this could possibly help her. As she began to pour the oil, something extraordinary happened. The oil, which had seemed so scarce, began to flow. It didn't stop after the first vessel or the second. It kept pouring, filling each vessel completely. The widow's eyes widened in disbelief and awe as the oil continued to flow, an unbroken stream that defied all logic. She filled vessel after vessel until every one was full. The miracle of provision was unfolding right before her eyes. With her heart filled with astonishment and gratitude, she went back to Elisha, who told her to sell the oil, pay off her debts, and keep what was left for herself and her sons. The widow had gone from the brink of ruin to a place of abundance. The oil had not only saved her sons from slavery, but had also given her a new beginning, a chance to rebuild her life. What if, like this widow, we had faith to use what we have, even if it seems small or insignificant? The jar of oil in her house seemed like nothing, but it became the vessel through which God worked a miracle. How often do we overlook the small blessings and provisions in our lives, unaware that they are the very things God will use to bring about His provision? In the quiet town of Shunem lived a woman of wealth and influence, but more importantly, a woman of discernment and generosity. Each time Elisha passed through her town on his journeys, she welcomed him with open arms, offering him food and rest. Over time, her hospitality grew into something greater. She prepared a room in her home so that whenever Elisha traveled that way, he would have a place to stay. It was a gesture of kindness that went beyond duty. It was born out of respect for the man of God and a desire to honor the presence of the divine in her household. Elisha, deeply moved by her generosity, sought to bless her in return. When he learned that she had no son and that her husband was advanced in years, he spoke a promise over her life that within a year she would embrace a child of her own. To her, the word seemed almost too good to be true, for she had long accepted her barrenness as unchangeable. Yet, just as the prophet declared, the following year her arms cradled the son she thought she would never have. The joy that filled her house was a living testimony that nothing is too difficult for the Lord. Echoing the words once spoken to Sarah in Genesis 18:14, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" But the story took a sudden, devastating turn. The child, the miracle she had cherished, suddenly fell ill and died in her arms. Her joy turned to anguish, her laughter to mourning. Yet, instead of surrendering to despair, the Shunammite woman clung to the faith that had carried her this far. With urgency and determination, she set out to find Elisha, refusing to accept that the story of her promised son would end in death. Elisha returned with her, his heart heavy with the weight of her sorrow. Entering the room where the lifeless boy lay, the prophet prayed earnestly to the Lord. Then, in a profound act of faith and obedience, Elisha stretched himself upon the child, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands. He did this not once, but persistently, until the boy's body grew warm again. And then, in a moment only heaven could orchestrate, the child sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. Life had returned. The house that had echoed with weeping was filled once again with joy and astonishment. This miracle was not just about the raising of a child, it was about the relentless mercy of God and the unwavering power of faith. It revealed that the same God who gives life is also the God who restores it. For the Shunammite woman, her hospitality opened the door to a miracle, and her faith in God's prophet opened the door to resurrection. How often in our lives do we face situations that feel beyond hope, where what was once a source of joy seems to have died in our hands? The Shunammite woman's story reminds us that faith refuses to let death write the final chapter. It dares to run to God, to seek His presence, and to believe that even when everything seems lost, restoration is still possible. What if the very things we think are over, dreams, relationships, callings, are simply waiting for God's touch to bring them back to life? The room she built for Elisha became the very place where her greatest miracle unfolded. In the same way, when we make space for God in our lives, He fills it with His presence, His power, and His mercy, often in ways that leave us utterly transformed. During a time of great famine, when hunger pressed upon the land like a relentless shadow, Elisha gathered with a company of prophets. Their stomachs ached with need, yet their hearts remained steadfast, trusting that God would sustain them even in scarcity. As they prepared a simple meal to satisfy their hunger, Elisha instructed them to make a stew, a gesture of hope in the midst of want. One of the men, eager to contribute, went out into the fields to gather herbs. In his haste, he unknowingly picked wild gourds, plants that looked nourishing but held within them a hidden poison. The gourds were chopped, added to the pot, and stirred into the stew. No one suspected the danger until the first spoonfuls were tasted. Immediately, the men realized something was terribly wrong. A cry broke out around the fire, "Man of God, there is death in the pot." The fear was not just of hunger now, but of death itself, creeping into what was meant to be their source of strength. Imagine the desperation in that moment. The very meal meant to sustain them threatened to destroy them. Yet Elisha did not panic. With a calm authority born of faith, he acted swiftly. He asked for flour and cast it into the pot. A simple gesture that became a vessel for divine power. To the untrained eye, it seemed like nothing more than adding an ingredient to a stew. But in reality, it was a prophetic act. The flour did what no human hand could have accomplished. It neutralized the poison, transforming death into life. The men ate again, and what had once been lethal was now safe, nourishing, and sustaining. This miracle was more than a rescue from physical danger. It was a sign of God's ability to intervene when human efforts fall short. The stew had been corrupted by something deadly, yet with a touch of divine power. What was once harmful became a source of life. Does this not echo the very heart of God's mercy, that He takes what is broken, tainted, even deadly, and restores it for His glory? How many times in our own lives do we find death in the pot, circumstances poisoned by mistakes, fear, or unseen dangers? Like the prophets, we may cry out in desperation, unsure of what to do. But the God who worked through Elisha is the same God who can transform what threatens us into what sustains us. Just as flour in the prophet's hands became the key to life, so too can our smallest offerings, surrendered in faith, become the instruments God uses to bring restoration. The stew of Shunem became a living parable of hope, that in famine, God provides, in danger, He protects, and where there is death, He speaks life. Elisha's works of wonder did not cease, they only grew in depth and power. Still in the midst of famine, when every grain of food was treasured like gold, a man approached him with an offering, 20 loaves of barley bread, baked from the first fruits of his harvest. To anyone else, this might have seemed small, even insignificant, especially against the backdrop of widespread hunger. Yet, in the hands of God's prophet, it became the seed of a miracle. Elisha turned to his servant and gave a simple instruction: distribute the bread among the people so they could eat. Immediately, doubt arose. The servant looked at the crowd, nearly 100 men gathered there, and then at the meager offering in his hands. His protest carried the voice of human reason. How can I set this before 100 men? To him, the loaves were inadequate, the math impossible. But Elisha, standing firm in faith, responded with words that carried divine certainty: give it to the people to eat. For this is what the Lord says, they will eat and have some left over. Then restoring to the crate, to the potter, with obedience, the bread was given out. And as it passed from hand to hand, something beyond comprehension took place. The loaves did not diminish. Instead, they multiplied, filling every hand, every lap, every stomach. The hungry men ate until they were satisfied, and still there was bread left over, overflowing abundance born out of scarcity. This moment revealed not just the power of God to provide, but his heart to provide abundantly. It foreshadowed the even greater miracle to come centuries later, when Jesus would take 5 loaves and 2 fish and feed thousands, again leaving baskets of leftovers. Just as Elisha's miracle pointed Israel to the faithfulness of God in famine, Christ's miracle pointed the world to the bread of life himself. Naaman, the mighty commander of the Syrian army, was a man of power and prestige, respected by his king and feared by his enemies. Yet beneath the armor that gleamed in the sunlight, he carried a hidden affliction, leprosy. This disease, incurable and humiliating, gnawed away at his pride and strength. No rank, no wealth, no military triumph could free him from its grip. His victories on the battlefield meant little compared to the slow defeat happening within his body. Word reached him of a prophet in Israel, Elisha, whose miracles were spoken of in hushed tones. Stories so extraordinary they stirred hope where hope had long died. Desperate, Naaman made the journey, bringing with him silver, gold, and fine garments. Convinced that such a prophet must be won over with lavish gifts, when he finally arrived at Elisha's house, he expected a grand ceremony, a dramatic display of power. But Elisha did not even come to greet him. Instead, through a messenger, he delivered a simple, almost insulting command. Go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan River, and your flesh will be restored. It was ants-bursts. Naaman's pride erupted. Was this how a great commander was to be treated? Were not the rivers of Damascus more noble than the muddy waters of the Jordan? He turned away in anger, ready to abandon the chance of healing. Yet, in that moment, his servants, humbler than their master, reasoned with him. If the prophet had asked for something great, would he not have done it? Why not obey this small command? Their words pierced his pride, and Naaman reluctantly descended into the Jordan. Once, twice, 3 times he dipped himself, the cold waters closing over him. Still, his skin bore the marks of his disease. 4 times, 5, 6, no change. But on the 7th immersion, something miraculous happened. As he rose from the water, his skin shone with the purity and softness of a child's pommin. The hardened soldier was undone, humbled, overwhelmed, and grateful. He declared with conviction that the God of Israel was the only true God. Overjoyed, Naaman tried to press his treasures upon Elisha, but the prophet refused, making it clear that God's power was not for sale. Yet as Naaman departed, Elisha's servant Gehazi wrestled with temptation. Greed whispered in his heart, drowning out loyalty and reverence. He secretly ran after Naaman and, under false pretenses, requested gifts in Elisha's name. Naaman, still overflowing with gratitude, gladly gave silver and clothing. Gehazi returned, hiding his ill-gotten gains. But nothing is hidden from God. Elisha confronted him with piercing eyes, declaring that his actions had betrayed the sacred trust of his calling as judgment. The very leprosy that had once tormented Naaman now clung to Gehazi and his descendants forever. This story resounds with sobering lessons. Pride nearly robbed Naaman of his miracle, but humility opened the door to healing. Greed, on the other hand, brought Gehazi to ruin, showing that no one who serves God can twist his gifts for selfish gain without consequence. How often do we, like Naaman, resist God's instructions because they seem too simple or beneath us? And how often do we, like Gehazi, risk everything by chasing after temporary gain? Naaman's restored skin was a testimony that God's power heals not just bodies but hearts. Gehazi's downfall, however, stood as a warning that dishonesty and greed carry a cost too great to bear. Together, their stories remind us that God's blessings are not earned with wealth or stolen with schemes. They are received with faith, humility, and integrity. One day, as Elisha's disciples worked together to build a new dwelling place, the sound of chopping wood echoed along the banks of the Jordan River. They labored with determination, each swing of their axes bringing them closer to their goal. But suddenly, in the midst of their work, disaster struck. With a sharp crack, the iron head of one of the axes flew off its handle and plunged into the depths of the river. The man who had been using it cried out in despair, for the axe was not even his own. It had been borrowed. To lose it meant more than embarrassment. It meant debt, shame, and hardship he could not afford. His voice trembled as he turned to Elisha, desperation written across his face. What was lost beneath the murky waters seemed impossible to recover. Yet Elisha, calm and unwavering, did not share the man's panic. Instead, he asked where the axe head had fallen. When shown the spot, Elisha cut a simple stick, cast it into the water, and then, in a moment that defied the laws of nature, the iron floated to the surface. The man reached out his hand and took back what he had thought was gone forever. This miracle, though not as dramatic as the parting of rivers or the raising of the dead, carried a message just as profound. It revealed that God's power was not reserved only for moments of great crisis or national importance, but extended even to the small, everyday struggles of life. An axe head, insignificant to some, mattered deeply to the man who had borrowed it, and because it mattered to him, it mattered to God. How often do we dismiss our daily troubles as too small to bring before the Lord? And yet, this story shows us that nothing escapes his care. Just as Elisha's act brought the axe head back from the depths, God is able to reach into the waters of our own lives, lifting up what has been lost, restoring what seems impossible to recover. The floating axe head became a sign that the God of Israel was not distant or unconcerned, but intimately involved in the lives of his people. He is the God who can heal nations, raise the dead, multiply bread, and yes, even make iron float. Nothing is too small, and nothing is too great for the hand of the Almighty. The story of Elisha's encounters with the Arameans reveals the astonishing depth of God's power, not only to defend his servant, but to turn despair into abundance. When the Arameans plotted against Israel, God exposed their plans to Elisha, who warned the king of Israel again and again. Frustrated, the king of Aram believed there must be a spy in his midst, until he was told, "It's not a spy, it is Elisha the prophet, who tells the king of Israel the very words you speak in your bedroom." Furious, The king sent a great army to capture this one man. They surrounded the city where Elisha was staying, their weapons gleaming in the morning light, their sheer numbers terrifying to behold. Elisha's servant, overwhelmed with fear, cried out when he saw the vast army outside their walls. But Elisha, steady and unshaken, prayed that God would open the young man's eyes. And suddenly, the veil of the unseen was lifted on the surrounding hills. He saw chariots of fire and horses of heaven, an army far greater than the one arrayed against them. The sight was overwhelming, a revelation that those who are with God's people are always more than those who oppose them. Then Elisha prayed again, and the Aramean soldiers were struck with blindness, helpless. They stumbled as Elisha himself led them straight into Samaria, the heart of Israel. There, their eyes were opened, and they realized they were surrounded by Israel's forces. Yet, instead of calling for their slaughter, Elisha showed mercy, commanding that they be fed and released. This act of unexpected kindness ended the raids against Israel, showing that God's victories are not always won with the sword, but often with wisdom and mercy. But peace was not permanent. In time, the king of Aram besieged Samaria itself, trapping the people inside the city walls. The famine that followed was so severe, it stripped away all humanity. Mothers turned on their own children. Desperation reigned. The cries of hunger filled the streets, and the horror of cannibalism spread through the city. In his anguish, the king of Israel blamed Elisha, swearing that the prophet would not live another day. Yet Elisha, unshaken even in the face of death, spoke a prophecy that seemed impossible. By this time tomorrow, food will be plentiful in Samaria's gates. Flour and barley will be sold cheaply, as though there had never been famine. To the starving, the words must have sounded like madness, but God was already at work. In the night, the Aramean army, so fierce, so confident, suddenly heard the sound of chariots, horses, and a vast army approaching. Terrified, believing they were about to be crushed by foreign reinforcements, they abandoned everything and fled into the darkness. Their tents, their weapons, their supplies of food, all were left behind. At dawn, the starving Israelites discovered the abandoned camp. Rushing in, they plundered it, and suddenly the famine ended in a single night. Just as Elisha had declared, the people who had been on the edge of despair now held food in their hands, proof that God's word never fails. These events stand as reminders of two great truths: that those who belong to God are never truly surrounded, for his armies stand unseen around them, and that his provision can turn the most hopeless famine into overflowing abundance in a single moment. How often do we, like Elisha's servant, see only the enemy before us and not the heavenly armies that surround us? And how often do we doubt, like the starving in Samaria, forgetting that God's promises are never bound by human limitations? Years later, the Shunammite woman, the very same who had once built a room for Elisha and witnessed her son brought back to life, faced another trial. A famine swept through the land, forcing her and her family to leave everything behind and seek safety elsewhere. For 7 long years she lived away from her home, her land lying desolate, her inheritance abandoned. When the famine finally ended, she returned, only to discover that her property had been seized by others. What had once been hers by right was now gone, leaving her with nothing. Desperate yet determined, She went to the king to plead for her land. It was not merely about fields and produce, it was about survival, about reclaiming the life she had lost. And here, in the mysterious weaving of divine timing, something extraordinary happened. Gehazi, Elisha's servant, was at that very moment standing before the king, recounting the miracles of his master. Among them, he told of the day when a child had died and lived again through Elisha's prayer. As Gehazi spoke, the Shunammite woman entered, her presence becoming the living testimony of the story he was telling. The king, astonished at the providence of such timing, listened as she confirmed the truth with her own lips. He was deeply moved, not only by her words, but by the undeniable evidence of God's power at work in her life. Without hesitation, he ordered her land to be restored, along with all the produce it had yielded during the years of her absence. This was no coincidence. It was a divine orchestration that revealed how God's favor moves at precisely the right moment. When the woman might have feared rejection, she found restoration. When she thought her losses were permanent, when she was given back not only her land, but the fruit of all those lost years. How often do we find ourselves returning to places where it seems too much has been taken from us? Time, opportunities, blessings, and wonder if restoration is even possible. The Shunammite woman's story shows that God does not just restore what was lost, He restores it with increase, ensuring that His timing magnifies His glory. It is a reminder that what God has marked as yours cannot be permanently stolen. Even after seasons of famine and exile, His favor arrives at the exact moment it is needed, turning loss into testimony and absence into abundance. Elisha's journeys eventually brought him to Damascus, where the powerful king of Aram, Ben-Hadad, lay on his sickbed, fearful of his fate. The king sent his trusted servant, Hazael, to inquire of the prophet whether he would recover from his illness. Laden with gifts and reverence, Hazael stood before Elisha, awaiting the word of the Lord. Elisha's reply was layered in mystery. He told Hazael that the king would surely recover from his sickness, yet in the same breath, his eyes fixed on Hazael with a piercing intensity that seemed to strip away every pretense. As Elisha gazed at him, the silence grew unbearable. Then, tears welled in the prophet's eyes, streaming down his face. Hazael, unsettled, asked why he wept, with a heavy voice. Elisha revealed what God had shown him. Hazael would indeed rise to power as king of Aram, but his reign would not be one of mercy. Instead, he would bring untold suffering upon Israel. Elisha saw visions of cruelty, fortresses set ablaze, young men cut down, children dashed, and pregnant women ripped open. The weight of such horrors overwhelmed him, for he knew that the man standing before him was the very instrument through which this devastation would come. Hazael, stunned and defensive, protested, "But what is your servant, a dog, that he could accomplish such things?" Yet Elisha's prophecy remained unshaken. The prophet had seen into the heart of the man, and he knew that ambition and ruthlessness already stirred within him. The following day, Elisha's grim words came to pass. Hazael returned to Ben-Hadad, assuring him of recovery, as Elisha had said, but driven by the seed of power now burning in his heart. Hazael suffocated the king with a wet cloth, seizing the throne for himself. The prophecy was fulfilled, and the shadow of his reign began to fall across Israel. This chilling moment reveals the depth of Elisha's prophetic sight, not only to foretell the future, but to feel the grief of it. It shows that God's servants are not immune to sorrow when they glimpse the suffering that lies ahead. It also reminds us of a sobering truth. Sometimes the gravest dangers to God's people do not come from distant threats, but from the rise of those whose hearts are corrupted by ambition. In the unfolding of God's judgment upon Israel, Elisha sent one of the younger prophets on a mission that would change the nation's course. He was to seek out Jehu, a seasoned commander in Israel's army, and anoint him king. In a private chamber, the prophet poured oil upon Jehu's head and declared the word of the Lord. Jehu had been chosen to destroy the house of Ahab and to bring an end to Jezebel's reign of wickedness. The task was not merely political, it was divine justice, a cleansing of the corruption that had spread through Israel under their rule. The weight of this calling settled immediately on Jehu. Empowered by the anointing, he wasted no time. His heart burned with zeal for the Lord's command, and his chariot wheels thundered with urgency as he rode to carry out God's decree. Jehu understood that his mission was not his own, he was the hand of judgment, chosen to fulfill the words spoken long ago by Elijah. His journey led him to Jezreel, where Queen Jezebel resided. Jezebel, infamous for her manipulations, idolatry, and ruthless power, stood defiantly at a window as Jehu approached. Dressed in finery, she painted her face and mocked him with scornful words, showing no fear even in the face of her impending downfall. But Jehu was unmoved. With a voice that carried both command and destiny, he called out to the servant standing with her, "Who is on my side? Who?" In that moment, several of her attendants looked down, and their loyalty shifted. At Jehu's command, they cast Jezebel from the window. Her body fell with a sickening crash, and the horses trampled her underfoot as Jehu entered the palace. Later, when they went to bury her, they found almost nothing remained, only her skull, her feet, and the palms of her hands. The dogs had devoured her flesh. Just as Elijah had prophesied years before, the death of Jezebel was more than the end of a queen, it was the closing of a dark chapter in Israel's history. Her reign of terror, which had brought idol worship and bloodshed into the heart of the nation, was finally silenced. The prophecy was fulfilled with chilling precision, leaving no doubt that God's word always comes to pass. Jezebel's downfall stands as a warning written in blood and dust. No matter how high someone exalts themselves, no matter how defiant they are against the living God, judgment will come. For Israel, her death marked a turning point, a moment when the grip of corruption began to break, and justice rolled forward like a tide no human power could resist. As the years passed, Elisha, once the fiery disciple who carried Elijah's mantle, grew old and weary. His body was failing, but the prophetic fire within him still burned. News of his illness spread, and soon King Joash of Israel came to his side. The king's heart was heavy with despair, for the threat of Aram loomed large, and the fate of Israel seemed uncertain. Standing by the dying prophet, Joash wept, crying out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." A lament, recognizing that Elisha himself was Israel's true defense, more powerful than armies and weapons. Though frail, Elisha's spirit remained sharp. Summoning strength, he instructed Joash to take a bow and arrows. As the king positioned himself, Elisha placed his own trembling hands upon Joash's, a symbolic gesture that the power of the prophet and the God he served still guided Israel. He told Joash to open the window and shoot. The arrow flew, and Elisha declared it the Lord's arrow of victory over Aram. This act was more than symbolism. It was a prophetic decree that Israel would triumph in battle. But Elisha's lesson was not yet finished. He commanded the king to take the arrows and strike the ground. Joash obeyed, but only struck 3 times before stopping. Elisha's face fell. Disappointment etched into his weakened features. With grief and frustration, he told the king that had he struck the ground 5 or 6 times, Israel would have utterly destroyed Aram. But because he struck only 3 times, Israel's victories would be limited. They would defeat Aram only 3 times, and then the struggle would remain unfinished. In this final encounter, Elisha revealed a truth that still resonates. The measure of our zeal often shapes the measure of our victories. Joash's half-hearted obedience cost him the fullness of triumph that God had prepared. Even on his deathbed, Elisha was teaching a lesson not just to a king, but to all who would hear his story, that faith and passion must be pursued without hesitation or restraint. Though his body was fading, Elisha's prophetic voice still carried the weight of heaven. With his final acts, he once again shaped Israel's destiny, proving that even as his earthly life drew to a close, the power of God working through him had not diminished. His last words and actions became a legacy, echoing across generations. When God calls us to act, we must act with all our strength, for half measures often rob us of the fullness of his promise. Elisha's long journey as a prophet eventually came to its end, and the man who had once carried Elijah's mantle was laid to rest in the earth. His body grew still, but the stories of his miracles, the healings, the provisions, the judgments, the victories remained alive in the hearts of Israel. To many, it might have seemed that with his death, a chapter of God's mighty works had closed. Yet God was about to reveal that his power was not bound by human life or death. Sometime after Elisha's burial, a band of Israelites carried another man to his grave. Their mourning was interrupted by sudden terror. Moabite raiders swept into the land, forcing them to act quickly. In their haste, they threw the dead man's body into the nearest tomb. That tomb belonged to Elisha. What happened next was nothing short of astonishing. The moment the corpse touched Elisha's bones, life surged back into him. The man's body, once lifeless and cold, was infused with divine power, and he rose to his feet, alive once more. The mourners, who had expected only to flee for their lives, stood witness to a miracle that defied all logic, even in death. The prophet was an instrument of God's power. This final wonder spoke with thunderous clarity. Elisha's ministry had not been his own, but the work of the living God, whose power does not fade with the passing of his servants. Just as the Lord had been faithful to Israel through Elisha's life, so too did he show that his spirit endures beyond death itself. The miracle at the tomb became a lasting testimony that God's presence cannot be buried. His purposes cannot be sealed away, and his power cannot be silenced by the grave. For the people of Israel, it was a reminder that the legacy of a man of God is never just the sum of his years. The same Spirit who had multiplied oil, raised the Shunammite sun, and struck down the armies of Aram, still lingered in the very bones of his prophet. And for us today, this story whispers a profound truth. The faithfulness of God endures beyond generations. His power outlives the vessels he chooses, and his purposes continue even when one chapter has closed. Elisha's death was not the end of his ministry. It was the seal upon a life so deeply saturated with God's presence that even his bones bore witness to divine power. His final miracle became his final sermon, a declaration that the God who brings life from death is never finished writing his story. The story of Elisha is far more than a record of miraculous events. It is a living tapestry woven with lessons of faith, obedience, and the unshakable power of God. From the very beginning of his calling, when Elijah cast the mantle upon his shoulders, Elisha's life was marked by humble service and steadfast devotion. He walked faithfully behind his master, not seeking glory, but seeking God. And it was this posture of humility and perseverance that opened the door for him to receive a double portion of Elijah's spirit. His story shows us that when we commit ourselves to God's purposes, when we serve with loyalty rather than ambition, God entrusts us with blessings and authority greater than we could ever earn on our own. Through Elisha's ministry, we also see the heart of God revealed as a provider in every circumstance. In the home of the desperate widow, where debt threatened to enslave her sons, God multiplied a single jar of oil until her needs were met. In the house of the Shunammite woman, where grief threatened to swallow her, God restored her son's life. On the plains, where 100 hungry men sat before only 20 loaves of barley bread, God multiplied until all were satisfied, and still there was more. Each miracle, whether grand or simple, proclaimed the same truth, that no matter the scarcity, no matter the impossibility, God is able. These moments remind us that divine intervention is not confined to great displays of power. It can be seen just as clearly in the ordinary details of life. An iron axe head made to float, bitter waters turned sweet, a small room in Shunem transformed into the setting of resurrection. Each testifies that nothing is too small, too hidden, or too hopeless for God's hand. What matters most is whether we trust Him enough to bring our lack, our despair, and even our impossibilities before Him. Elisha's life stands as a testament that those who walk in faith and obedience will not only see God's wonders, but will themselves become vessels of His presence. His story invites us to ask, are we willing to be as faithful in service, as bold in trust, and as surrendered in obedience as he was? For the God who worked through Elisha is the same God who still works today, providing, restoring, and making the impossible possible for all who put their hope in Him. Another thread woven through Elisha's story is the undeniable power of compassion. Though he was a prophet anointed with authority and boldness, his heart overflowed with mercy toward the people he served. We see it when he weeps over the suffering Israel would face under Hazael, when he intercedes for his frightened servant and prays for his eyes to be opened, and when he responds to widows, mothers, and communities with care rather than dismissal. Time and again, God's power flowed through him to heal, restore, and bring hope to the broken, not because he sought greatness for himself, but because his heart reflected God's compassion. In the same way, we too are called to become vessels of that same mercy, extending kindness and grace to those who are weary and in need, so that God's love might be made visible through our lives. Finally, Elisha's story draws our eyes to God's sovereignty. Every page of his life is a reminder that nothing happens outside of God's hand. From healing poisoned stew to rescuing armies, from multiplying food to raising the dead, from defending Israel against its enemies to fulfilling ancient prophecies with exact precision, each moment testifies that God reigns over all. Even in Elisha's death, when his bones touched a lifeless body and it sprang to life again, the message was clear: God's power cannot be bound by time. circumstance, or even the grave. Through Elisha's life, we are reminded of this eternal truth. With God, nothing is impossible. His compassion meets our deepest needs. His provision sustains us in scarcity, and His sovereignty governs every detail of history and of our own lives. The story of Elisha is not just an ancient record, it is an invitation. It calls us to trust God with every aspect of our journey, to live with faith that He will provide, with obedience that honors His call, and with compassion that reflects His heart to a broken world. Elisha's story does not fade into the pages of history. It lives on as a powerful reminder of who God is and what He can do through those who are willing to trust Him fully. From the widow's oil that never ran out, to the boy who rose from death, to the armies blinded and the food multiplied. Every miracle was a declaration that God is present in every detail of our lives, both great and small. For me, the most moving part of his story is how it shows that compassion, faith, and obedience are never wasted. Even when circumstances seemed hopeless, God proved that He is never late, and that His sovereignty always brings life where despair once reigned. In our world today, where so many are weighed down by fear, scarcity, and uncertainty, Elisha's life whispers a challenge and a promise. If God could use a humble farmer to shake nations, what could He do through us when we choose faith over doubt and compassion over indifference? His story encourages us to believe that no obstacle is too great, no situation too far gone, for God to transform. This is the lesson I carry from Elisha. Trust God not only with the big battles but with the smallest details. Allow His compassion to shape how we treat others. And most of all, live with the expectation that miracles still happen when we walk closely with Him. If this message has spoken to you, I invite you to be part of this journey with us. Like this video. Share it so others can be inspired. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story of faith. And leave a comment below with what part of Elisha's life touched you most. Your engagement not only blesses this channel, it helps spread God's word further than we could ever reach alone. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for every like, every share, every subscription, and every word of encouragement in the comments. Together, we are building a community that chooses faith, hope, and love in a world that desperately needs it. May God bless you richly as you walk in His power, His mercy, and His unfailing promise.